afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I am Nina Della Salas, Senior Associate at MN Associates, Inc. M&A is presenting and facilitating today's webinar. Today's webinar offers tips on developing your research and evaluation plans for the 2026 Track 3 S-STEM grant proposals. Next slide, please. As you enter the Zoom meeting, please take a moment to introduce yourself using the chat box. Please share your role, whether you're a grant writer, PI, co-PI, institutional research staff member, researcher, or evaluator, the name of your institution, and which track you're applying. So for this is track 3. If you're interested, track 1 and 2 was earlier presented. If you have any burning questions, please write them in the Q&A box, and we will collate and address them at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. Before we dive in, I want to highlight a few housekeeping points. As I said, we'll be using the Q&A box to collect your questions and respond to them at the end of the presentation. Please upvote questions you are interested in. We can also open the microphones for those unable to post their questions in the Q&A box at that time. There are several visual aids available during this webinar. A transcriber is handling live closed captioning, and a team of ASL interpreters is available. You can also follow along using the link to the slides provided in the chat. Finally, if you experience any technical difficulties, please contact Rachel Stivers at rstivers, that's R-S-T-I-V-E-R-S, at AAAS.org. Next slide. This material is based upon work supported by the National Science Foundation under grant number DUE 2224093. Any opinions, findings, interpretations, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this material are those of its authors and do not represent the views of the AAAS Board of Directors, the Council of AAAS, AAAS membership, or the National Science Foundation. Please note that the REC is promoting consultation with M&A as they are a REC partner. However, this does not constitute an endorsement of M&A as evaluators by the National Science Foundation. Next slide, please. Thank you. The goal of the S-STEM REC is to build the capacity of S-STEM network programs, build the capacity of the S-STEM scholars, and increase the effectiveness of the S-STEM portfolio by synthesizing evidence of outcomes and impacts across the entire network and disseminating those findings widely. Next slide, please. Although the S-STEM REC is managed by AAAS, the full team consists of several partner organizations that work together to advance the REC's goals. As I said, today's webinar is being facilitated by M&A, and M&A provides evaluation and research capacity building for the S-STEM community through the REC. Next slide, please. M&A is an established K-16 research and evaluation consulting firm based in Fairfax, Virginia, with clients across the nation. M&A is currently evaluating 9 S-STEM grants across all tracks, including an S-STEM hub and the PI mentoring project. As part of the S-STEM REC Evaluation Capacity Development Suite, M&A is assisting both prospective and current S-STEM PIs, co-PIs, social science researchers, and evaluators. M&A's primary focus is to provide technical assistance and guidance on the generation of knowledge, or GoK, for tracks 1 and 2, and in the development of research and evaluation plans for track 3 S-STEM's proposals, as well as provide ongoing TA to both researchers and evaluators for their ongoing projects. Next slide, please. From now through March 3rd, M&A will provide a suite of supports to assist you as you prepare your Track 3 proposal submissions. Besides this webinar, we will have another webinar on February 17th that will cover logic models and theory of change. There are also resources available in the resource section of the S-STEM Rec website, which you can refer to. Should you need more customized assistance, you can contact the evaluation TA team using the QR code that you see there and by clicking on the TA request form. Next slide, please. We've designed today's webinar to help you gain a better understanding of what research and evaluation for Track 3 proposals entail, and tips for writing the research and evaluation plans for the same. At the end of the webinar, we ask that you complete a very brief survey to help us understand how well this webinar meets its objectives, improve on future webinars, and know more about you and your needs. Next slide, please.
We need to go back to one slide.
Yes, thank you. So here is the rundown of what we'll cover today. Leading us today's webinar is Dr. Kavita Mittapalli, CEO of M&A. For over 20 years, she has conducted research and evaluation for various programs and initiatives, including multiple S-STEM grants. She worked at various consulting firms before founding M& Associates, Inc. in 2004. Kavita started her career in agricultural science before becoming an applied sociologist and a mixed methodologist. Kavita earned her PhD in education research design and methodology. She brings her multidisciplinary skills and knowledge to all the work she does at M&A. Kavita?
Thank you so much, Nina. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning. We are delighted that you have taken some time today to join us for this webinar. As Nina mentioned, I'm Kavita Mittapalli, CEO of M&A, a K-16 research and evaluation firm, and we are the TA providers for evaluation for the S-STEM Rec at AAAS. Okay, so let's begin. Next slide, please. Next. All right, so before we get into the nitty-gritty of research for Track 3, let's talk really about what is NSF really asking for, right? So Track 3 is the inter-institutional consortia. So Track 3 projects are led by strong multi-institutional leadership teams that are brought together by an institution, a lead institution, with partner institutions, by the faculty members who are teaching in STEM eligible disciplines. It also consists of senior STEM administrators, also non-teaching researchers with expertise in institutional, educational, or social science research. The lead PI must be a faculty member in an eligible STEM discipline, a senior STEM administrator, or a qualified non-teaching researcher. And they must demonstrate the capacity, experience, and time commitment required to manage a complex, large-size consortium. Key faculty members from all participating institutions and disciplines are expected to be meaningfully engaged as members of the leadership team and/or as senior or key personnel. So collectively, the leadership team must have access to all the resources, infrastructure, and coordination mechanisms necessary to ensure the project is successful in alignment with the most current NSF PAPG requirements. All this basically means that Track 3 represents a fundamental shift from Tracks 1 and 2. So we covered in details what the solicitation really entails in regards to Track 1 and Track 2 last week. So the recording and the slides are already available online, so please take a minute if you're applying for Tracks 1 or 2. So NSF is really not as asking for expanded evaluation or descriptive generation of knowledge. So here we are using generation of knowledge as an umbrella, broader term. Instead, the track 3 really requires high quality, theory driven research that is designed to explain how and why evidence based practices, or EBP, you will hear me use that term a lot today, support low income STEM scholars across the institutional context. Right. So the emphasis really on track 3 is on studying the mechanisms, the context, and transferability. Research must be led by faculty or senior personnel with education or social science expertise, and those individuals may not serve as evaluators. So, this separation essentially is intentional and required for all track 3 proposals. So, the goal here is explanation, not just documentation. All right, next slide. Okay. So another overview slide here, because we forget. The track 3 proposals may request up to $5 million in total funding for a project period of up to 6 years. So 6 years is constant across track 1, 2, and 3. A defining feature of track 3 is a substantial investment in direct scholar support. At least 60% of the total budget must be allocated exclusively to the scholarships. There must be pure scholarships that directly cover the cost of attendance and must be budgeted as participant support stipends. All non-scholarship expenses, including research activities, evaluation, personnel, coordination, and dissemination of the results, must be supported within the 40% of the budget. In addition, Track 3 projects undergo a formal and pretty intensive NSF review in year 3, with continued funding contingent upon satisfactory progress towards the project and research goals. Note, research goals as well. Next slide, please. All right. Now let's get into the research aspect of Track 3. Next slide, please. So Track 3 projects are required to include a strong research component that advances the understanding of how effective research-based practices, or EBPs, can be adapted, implemented, and scaled to support the positive outcomes for low-income scholars in STEM. And this is already mentioned, is that the research must be led by PIs, co-PIs, or senior personnel with expertise in social science or educational research. And individuals involved in the research component may not serve as external evaluators for the project. The S-STEM program also welcomes the use of appropriate theoretical frameworks and methodological approaches in Track 3. We will talk about these in a lot of details today, provided they are also well aligned with the research questions and are designed to generate generalizable knowledge. Next slide, please. So those of you who attended last week's session, I did have the slide, and this slide is common because it generally talks about the scientific inquiry and the generation of knowledge. Keep in mind, generation of knowledge term is used as an umbrella term that is really helping to advance the knowledge about S-STEM, about how and why things work in an S-STEM project. So this slide basically anchors Track 3 research in established definitions of scientific inquiry. Scientific research is systematic, theory-informed and driven, and designed to generate knowledge that extends beyond the single project. So that is the purpose of generation of knowledge. But the term that is used in Track 1 and Track 2 is generation of knowledge, but in Track 3, it is research. So when NSF refers to generalizable knowledge, they do not just mean one-size-fits-all findings. They mean findings where the mechanisms and context are sufficiently understood that other institutions can reasonably anticipate how their context may also influence the outcomes. So this is fundamentally different from, descriptive reporting or compliance monitoring, which is part of the generation of knowledge and evaluation in basically track one and track two. So there is a link here, which I think Rachel or Tara would be adding in the chat. Please take a moment to click on it, and you will see there is a whole lot of details about the whole process of scientific inquiry, generation of knowledge, and a little bit about the nature of research study, which we are going to talk about in the next slide. All right, let's talk about the nature of research. Again, going back to track three. Track three projects are intentionally designed as complex, multi-institutional systems rather than a single campus programs, which again, most of us know is for track one and track two. So looking at the icons here, the stacked layers of icon really represents the integration of multiple evidence-based practices, or EBPs, which are operating simultaneously across institutions, rather than as isolated interventions or elements or activities. The network icon really represents a consortium structure itself, formal partnerships among institutions that share the responsibility for scholar success, research, evaluation, and overall coordination of the S-STEM project. The institutional icon here highlights the central role of participating colleges and universities, each contributing distinct contexts, scholar populations, and implementation environments that are very critical for conducting research. The analytics icon really underscores the emphasis on rigorous data collection and data use, which for track three means longitudinal tracking, cross-site analysis, and, mind you, theory-driven research methods that examine the mechanisms and variations in scholar outcomes. The lab icon represents the research enterprise, which is embedded within track three, including the systematic study of how EBPs are planned, adapted, and implemented, and mind you, also scaled across the various settings. I cannot emphasize enough, context really matters. The scale icon represents accountability and compliance, which also includes adherence to NSF policies, ethical research standards, and IRB requirements. The growth icon represents the ultimate goal of track three, creating sustainable, scalable models that foster positive academic persistence and post-secondary outcomes for low-income STEM scholars that goes beyond the life of the grant. This is all to say that track three research is inherently multi-institutional and longitudinal. Mind the words, multi-institutional and longitudinal. We are not just asking whether scholars are persisting or graduating or completing, but how those trajectories unfold over time and across different institutional environments and context. Again, track three research is inherently multi-institutional and longitudinal. We are not just asking whether these scholars are persisting or graduating in time, but how these trajectories unfold over time and across various institutional environments/contexts. This requires intentional design choices that relates to timing, comparison groups, and institutional variations. For instance, your project may have a combination of R1, R2 MSIs, or your project may have a combination of R1, R2 for your institution, predominantly undergraduate institution, and community college. So the design will vary. Keep that in mind. So the goal is not perfect causal certainty, but stronger inference than simple before and after comparisons. So NSF really expects awareness of these design challenges. So that's why it's really critical that when you have a moment, please go to that link. There are lots of details about the nature of study. Why would you choose a particular study over another? What kind of design you're going to use? What kind of methodology you're going to use? And why? Because it will all really depend on your project. It will all really depend on what you're trying to find out. Okay, next slide, please. So, what are some of the key elements of a research plan for track 3? So, a strong track 3 research plan has 3 non-negotiable elements. First, a clearly articulated theoretical framework. We are going to talk about the theories later, which is grounded in research or social science theory. Secondly, research questions that are clearly focused on persistence, retention, transfer, or graduate pathways for low-income STEM scholars. Third, a clear rationale for data collection sources and analytical methods. Reviewers look for alignment. They look for alignment in terms of how is the theory informing the questions, how are the questions driving the methods, and also the cross-institutional and longitudinal thinking is essential when you are designing your R3 research portion. So this basically translates to how the S-STEM project that you are working on, that you are proposing, elements the influence academic and behavior outcomes of the low-income scholars. What are some of the cross-institutional comparisons? This is critical. And what are some of the longitudinal patterns in course performance, retention, and degree attainment? Okay, next slide. Okay, now how do we conceptually frame this in track 3? So the research component of track 3, as I mentioned before, is designed to generate generalizable theory-informed knowledge about how S-STEM interventions are functioning for low-income STEM scholars at the various institutions. Primarily, it focuses on examining the causal mechanisms, mind the word, causal mechanisms that link low-income status, participation in S-STEM activities, and key academic and persistence outcomes. So collectively, this research is really intended to inform how the effective practices / interventions / activities / EBPs can be adapted, replicated, and scaled across diverse institutional contexts. So in terms of the conceptual framing, the low income status of the scholars is really treated as a structural condition and not as a demographic label. Again, the low income status is treated as a structural condition and not a demographic label, which helps to shape the opportunity, the constraint, and decision making, not simply as, again, as I mentioned, a demographic label. So the S-STEM practices are also treated as interventions or EBPs. And outcomes are examined through mediating and moderating mechanisms, such as reduced financial stress, academic skill development, professional development, self-efficacy, and sense of belonging. So this framing really allows the research team or the researcher to move from did it work to how and why did it work. So this framing is really critical, where the researcher is not only looking at, well, did it work? Yes or no? But no, he's really looking at how and why did this work. Okay. So now you must be wondering, this is all nice and beautiful. Is she going to talk about research questions? Yes, I will. Thanks for asking. There you go. So here we have some sample research questions. Again, don't copy and paste them because, it's going to really vary for your project. But here's something that we have worked on some of our projects, and I've changed them a little bit for the webinar. So let's carefully look at research question 1. So RQ1 is focusing on identifying the causal mechanisms through which the S-STEM participation influences academic success for low-income scholars. Mind the terms that I'm using. I'm not using impact, right? I'm using the term influencing or influences the academic success for low-income STEM scholars. So rather than asking whether the outcomes improve, this question really examines how specific evidence-based practices operate by shaping intermediate processes such as financial stability, academic engagement, and psychosocial factors. So RQ1 is explicitly designed for mediation analysis. So mediation really tests whether the effect of S-STEM participation on the intended outcomes operates through an intermediate variable, which is the reduced financial stress, increased self-efficacy, or having a strong sense of belonging. A mediating variable, those who have taken enough ed psych or social science research courses like I have, a mediating variable explains how or why an effect occurs. Effect, as in EFFECT, occurs. So within each research question, you could also have some sub-questions, right? For instance, RQ1 has a sub-question, which mechanisms, again, looking at mechanisms, most strongly mediate the outcomes? And are these effects consistent across institutional contexts? So the core question for RQ1 is looking at the causal mechanisms. Now let's look at RQ2, which essentially focuses on identifying the causal mechanisms through, it builds on this actually. RQ2 really builds on RQ1 by examining the aspirations and decision making as key mediators that link the S-STEM participation to longer term outcomes, including persistence, graduate degree pathways. Together, as we see it, both RQ1 and RQ2, they shift the analytic focus from outcomes alone to processes and decisions that help to explain why the S-STEM interventions or EBPs are effective for low-income STEM scholars. Right. So the graduate aspirations, as per RQ2, are treated not simply as outcomes, but they're really looked upon as the mediating variables. So the research asks whether the S-STEM participation shifts perceptions of feasibility, utility, and cost, and whether these shifts help to explain the later persistence or graduate enrollment. So these mechanisms are really helping us to determine the outcomes. So the way we look at these sample questions, RQ1 and RQ2, is that the research questions are intentionally mechanism focused, right? I have mentioned this many times. So rather than treating outcomes as endpoints, they are really emphasizing on examining the processes and pathways linking to low income status of the scholars, and also participation in S-STEM and academic outcomes. So this explanatory framing is exactly what NSF expects for the track 3 research, given the scale of investment. So another critical distinction here is that those of you who attended our webinar last week, in tracks 1 and track 2, the generation of knowledge questions often ask whether the outcomes improved and what activities were kind of associated with the improvement. right? But in track 3, the questions go much deeper and much further by explicitly modeling the causal pathways and the underlying mechanisms and contexts. So that's the critical distinction in how you're expected to generate knowledge in tracks 1 and track 2. And then you're really doing research in track 3. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. So this slide really talks about the academic skill development using this as a mechanism. So here, improvement in mathematical reasoning and problem solving is modeled as a mediating mechanism, right? Rather than simply reporting skill gains, the research really is testing whether these gains explain the later academic outcomes, such as GPA, course completion, or even persistence. So, in a sense, this question is strengthening the explanatory claims, the explanatory, and not exploratory, but explanatory claims. Then, so essentially, RQ3 is moving us from scholars improved in math to math improvement explains why and how the outcomes improved. Okay, now look at RQ3B, active ingredients. This question is focusing on identifying the active ingredients of supplementary instruction. That's also an EBP or evidence-based practice. So the active ingredients are the specific components that drive the outcome, such as dosage, modality, timing, or even instructional design. And dosage, as most of you know, refers to the intensity and exposure. How often, how long, and how consistently. Identifying the active ingredients directly supports NSF's emphasis on adaptation and scaling, which are required again for track 3 research proposals. Next slide. RQ4, comparative and counterfactual framing. This question essentially introduces quasi-experimental logic by comparing the S-STEM scholars to similarly situated low-income non-participants. Now, similarly situated signals attention to selection bias. So the analysis approximates a counterfactual. What would have happened in the absence of S-STEM scholarship and participation? Right. Again, the critical distinction here, track 1 and track 2, the generation of knowledge comparisons are often descriptive and kind of on the surface. Track 3, however, comparisons are embedded within the causal and quasi-experimental logic process. So the intent is really using matching, which could be done through propensity score matching, which is very common, or genetic matching, which we use at M&A, which is much more approximate. You also do covariate controls, and you're really essentially looking at quasi-experimental designs. You don't do RCTs, randomized controlled trials, but you do quasi-experimental designs with a comparison group. Okay, next slide, please. So research design at a glance, right? So we have talked about RQ1, RQ2, 3A, 3B, and 4, giving you solid examples of what kind of research questions you should be developing or you should be looking at based on the project that you are working on, depending on the partners, depending on the institutional context, and based on the research and literature as to what are some of the underlying mechanisms that you're interested to investigate through your research. So this slide shows alignment among research questions, some of the data sources, and analytical strategies. So track 3 research often uses mixed methods, right? Because you have a bigger N size. It also uses longitudinal designs, and there is cross-institutional data. Covariates play an important role. As most of you may know, covariates are variables that we statistically control for, such as prior academic preparation or enrollment intensity, to reduce bias and to strengthen the inference of the research that we are conducting. So look at some of the constructs that you may be interested in, the mechanisms, the aspirations, the skill mediation, the instruction elements, and peer comparison. So these basically outline and summate the kind of questions that we just talked about. What are some of the key data sources here? Surveys, longitudinal surveys, pre-post math assessments, course grades, dosage of data, instructional artifacts if they're available, observations if you're able to do that through site visits or virtual observations, and you're also accessing institutional records, and you're going to do a matched comparison group data. Some of the analytical approach would be mixed methods explanatory models, growth modeling, qualitative path analysis, mediation models, regressions, depending on what your research questions are. Next slide, please. Okay. So the analytical language, or at least this is our perception, what are some of the terms that NSF might be looking for in your research section? So terms like mediation, you have moderation, covariates, quasi-experimental design, counterfactual signal methodological rigor, right? And mediators also explain how these effects occur, right? And the moderators explain when or for whom these effects are stronger or weaker. For example, the institutional context or the academic starting point. Using these terms really matters to the reviewers. So the kind of terms that you do not want to use is directly saying impact. You don't use the term impact without explanation, evidence, and context. Also avoid using causes without a solid methodological design and supporting methods to justify it. Next slide, please. Okay. So as I mentioned, we use the term EBPs a lot, right? Evidence-based practices. So in track 3, EBPs are essentially not just activities, but they are the units of analysis. These are the interventions, the elements that we have used in different terms. So EBPs are grounded in literature, right? And they're also aligned with the documented needs of your scholars. So the research really explains how the EBPs function across the different institutions, different contexts, rather than simply saying that they exist. Now, how do you find out which EBPs are most suitable for your population, for the scholars? You conduct a needs assessment. Usually the needs assessment would have been done already, or maybe it's underway now, because that will give you an idea of what are the needs of the prospective scholars in the S-STEM project. You also conduct an extensive literature review so that you can establish a rationale for the proposed EBPs. You also align those activities with documented low-income scholar and institutional needs. All of them need to stick together. The literature review also helps to include evidence from research, which helps to support these interventions that are effective within an institutional context. For instance, a certain EBP, evidence-based practice, that works in a four-year institution may not be that effective or even applicable in a community college setting. So you want to make sure that those needs really talk to each other and they are really helping the scholars that you're about to serve. The evidence-based interventions are also linked to the identified needs and they target the scholar S-STEM population across the partners. There might be some activities that are applicable to an R1, R2, an MSI, an HBCU, and there might be some other interventions or EBPs that are more applicable for community college. For mentorship and cohorts, plan for S-STEM faculty mentors and scholar cohorts that are required for all tracks. So make sure that you have a research question that is also able to assess or measure the mentorship and also the cohort-based mentorship. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so we have done a bit of homework. We have over 32 EBPs as repositories with validated scales and instruments and tools already on the AAAS website. So if you go through stemrec.AAAS.org/resources and you check on EBPs, you will get at least 6 pages, 6 to 7 pages of various EBPs. Here's a sample. Experiential Learning EBP repository. There are a bunch of, when you download, you will see a bunch of references. And when you click on the references, that will take you to the research, the literature, and most of them also have validated scales. And these scales is what that you could actually use once you're awarded, or you can cite them that these are the scales that we are going to use once we are awarded. Another example is interdisciplinary research. The third is bridge programs. We've seen bridge programs come often and proposed in track 2 proposals. Academic advising, a very common and a requirement, right? So you will see 32 EBPs once you go into that list. And there's a QR code too. Okay, so now let's look at the research questions once we embed the EBPs for more specificity. So RQ1, that was the core mechanism of the EBPs, now becomes like a question which would sound or which would read like, how do the EBPs, such as summer research, tutoring, or mentoring, implemented through the S-STEM, mitigate the effective behavioral or dispositional barriers that are often associated with low income status of STEM scholars? And a sub-question could be, through what mechanisms do these changes contribute to the academic success across the institutional context? Right, you see how I have changed the research question 1 once I embedded the EBP of, say, summer research, tutoring, or mentoring. Now let's look at RQ2 that is related to the aspirations. So the question that you might frame is, in what ways do S-STEM evidence-based practices shape the graduate degree aspirations and educational decision-making among low-income STEM scholars? Part 2 would be, how do these shifts mediate the longer-term academic and career outcomes? Right? Then let's look at research question 3, which is skill development, skill mediation as a mechanism. So the kind of question that you would have here is, to what extent or how does improvement in mathematical reasoning and problem solving, supported by S-STEM evidence-based practices, mediate the relationship between low income status and academic success outcomes among the S-STEM scholars? For RQ3B, we talked about active ingredients. Your question would be, which evidence-based instructional practice are most effective in facilitating growth in mathematical reasoning and problem solving among low-income STEM scholars across institutional contexts? On the final RQ4, the comparative impact of EBPs, the kind of question you would frame is, how do STEM scholars participating in EBPs compare to similarly situated low-income non-STEM peers in academic outcomes, retention, and pursuit of graduate degrees. And part two could be what mechanisms explain the observed differences. So EBPs are now the unit of analysis, they're not just activities. And this directly mirrors the track 3 solicitation language. And it also supports the claims about adaptation, overall implementation, and scaling. Really critical for track 3. Next slide, please. Now, let's talk about theory in S-STEM research. So, consistent with the S-STEM track 3 emphasis on high quality, theory-driven research, your T3 research study will also be guided by complementary theoretical framework that helps to explain how the evidence-based practices mitigate the structural barriers associated with low-income STEM scholars' status, while also supporting the academic and post-baccalaureate success in STEM. The theory essentially elevates track 3 research from merely being descriptive to explanatory, the why, the how. And as I read before, NSF welcomes multiple frameworks. It's from solicitation, and I read as is, but expects them to be well justified and integrated. So we've been talking about this in terms of not only the why, how, but it has to be done in a way that speaks to your project, that speaks to your institutional context. So essentially, a theoretical framework or a theory guides what is measured, how findings are interpreted, and how these results contribute to the broader knowledge. That's what theory does. So theory guides what is measured, how the findings are interpreted, and how the results contribute to the broader knowledge. Next slide, please. Now let's look at some of the common theories, right? So many of you might be familiar with these theories. The social cognitive theory, Bandura, it has been adapted and revised several times over. But let's talk about the relevance to S-STEM. So the social cognitive theory provides a very strong explanatory framework for understanding how S-STEM interventions influence the scholar persistence and overall success. Essentially, the social cognitive theory emphasizes the role of self-efficacy. We have seen that many times in the proposals. Outcome expectations and goal setting in shaping the scholar's academic behaviors, making it well aligned with the evidence-based practice, such as mentoring, formative feedback, skill building, professional development, summer research, what have you. So within a track 3 research design, this framework is particularly useful for examining the affective and the dispositional outcomes, and for conducting mediation analysis that test whether improvements in self-efficacy explain the relationship between S-STEM participation and persistence or degree attainment. So that's all about the social cognitive theory and how you can apply that directly to your track 3 research. So it's useful for assessing the affective and dispositional outcomes and for conducting mediation analysis. So how does a particular EBP lead to change in self-efficacy? And that will hopefully lead to persistence, degree attainment, or even STEM participation. Next slide, please. A few more. Let's look at the contextual and some of the cultural ecological theories. The one that comes to my mind is the expectancy value theory. And um, it basically is anchored on the belief that success, perceived value, and perceived cost shape persistence and decision making for a person. So, why is it relevant and how is this relevant to the S-STEM scholars? So, we think that the expectancy value theory is relevant for the low income STEM scholars because it explicitly incorporates the cost, the feasibility, and utility. And in combination with the social cognitive theory, the expectancy value theory, together, they allow the testing of the mechanisms rather than just the assumptions. Now, some of the other theories are the model of academic and social integration. Again, that's a Tinto model, and that's very widely used in vast number of STEM proposals. The cultural, ecological, or the context models, they also situate the student outcomes or scholar outcomes within the institutional, social, and economic context, which is very relevant to the STEM projects. So these networks essentially explain why the same practice may function differently across institutions because context matters. They also support the moderation analysis and are essential for understanding the adaptation and scaling. I've said this many times. So, together, these theories allow the research to examine the scholar level mechanisms, institutional context, and the evidence based practice implementation in an aligned and integrated manner, which is consistent with the STEM Track 3 goal of generating generalizable knowledge to help inform the adaptation and scaling across institutions. Again, we are not committing to a single theory, but rather using a small set of complementary frameworks here to give you an example, which are at scholar level, contextualized, and also implementation focused. That essentially allow us to examine the mechanisms, the EBPs, and cross-institutional variation, which is exactly what Track 3 is looking for. Next slide, please. So, in terms of the research and evaluation overview, summing it up, research and evaluation essentially serve different purposes. We are going to talk about evaluation next. Research is generating generalizable knowledge about mechanisms and context, while evaluation is supporting the implementation, the learning, and accountability of this project. So Track 3 projects require both a research component that generates this knowledge and a separate evaluation component that is essentially supporting the project's improvement and overall accountability. Research and evaluation serve distinct but complementary purposes. Together, they are advancing the understanding of how evidence-based STEM practices mitigate structural barriers associated with low-income status across institutional contexts. If someone asks you what's the key difference between research and evaluation, you could say research asks why, how, and under what conditions do interventions work, while evaluation is asking whether implementation, outputs, and outcomes align with the project goals. So the difference is not just the data, it is the purpose and the analytic logic. Okay, so you will see the bar under the research and evaluation. That's the clear distinction between the two. Next slide, please. All right, now let's talk about project evaluation. Next slide, please. All right, so the evaluation is, again, as I mentioned, the difference between research and evaluation is really in terms of the intent, the purpose, and the analytical logic. Another clear distinction between the two is a unit of analysis. For evaluation, the unit of analysis really is the STEM project itself. Evaluation is highly iterative and it is utilization focused. Findings are intended to inform the overall decisions in real time, not just at the end of the grant, right? That's why you have the formative and you have the summative stages. The formative really is in the first couple of years, and then in the latter years, the fourth, fifth, and sixth years, essentially, it turns into a summative evaluation where you're really focusing on the outcomes, the so what. We've done all this, so what? And the most critical part here is the feedback loop that helps to support the continuous improvement and effective project management. We're going to talk about how to really engage with your evaluate in the next couple of slides, but essentially, this is what evaluation is all about. It's iterative, utilization focused, it has feedback loops, it is a continuous process, and it helps to inform decisions in real time, not just at the end of the grant. And the feedback loop really supports the continuous improvement and effective project management. We're going to talk about logic model in the next session, which is on February 17th. And we will also talk about how the logic model informs the evaluation and how the evaluation informs the logic model, so on and so forth. So please sign up for that session as well. And we will also be happy to share some resources that you can just plug and play. Next slide, please. Now let's look at some of the sample evaluation questions. This is also from the last week's slide because things haven't changed. Evaluation has not changed. So what are some of the key metrics or areas that we are looking to measure as an evaluator? We're looking at the project's fidelity of implementation and overall efficacy of the project. So the kind of question you would be asking is, to what extent is your S-STEM project being planned and implemented as desired? What's working, what's not working, and why? What are some of the key lessons learned? Now, the second metric that we will be interested to assess in the evaluation is the academic success in the project. To what extent do the project interventions, such as financial support, advising, mentoring, so on and so forth, enhance the overall academic performance of low-income scholars? Keep in mind, we are not looking at the why and how, but just the what aspects. Another question related to the academic success could be, how do scholars' participation in certain project activities correlate with the academic outcomes such as GPA, course completion rates at your institution? We're using the term correlate. The other aspect is also the career and workforce readiness in the project that NSF is keenly interested in. So the kind of question that you could ask is, how effectively does the project prepare low-income talented STEM scholars for STEM workforce in terms of entry, in terms of getting an advanced education degree, doing some research, internships, jobs, etc., etc. Another question could be, what proportion of S-STEM scholars secure STEM-related internships, jobs, or graduate that I mentioned? So the metrics being project's fidelity and overall efficacy, academic success in the project, and also career and workforce readiness in your S-STEM project. Next slide, please. Now let's look at this evaluation matrix. The reason I have it here is that we don't have a lot of space in the 15-page narrative, right? So generally, as an evaluator, we request the PIs or co-PIs or grant writers, whoever is working on the project, to leave about a page and a half. Sometimes they're only able to leave maybe a page. So that's when we write the evaluation plan, the evaluation questions, make a very clear distinction between research and evaluation if we are evaluating a track 3. And we have a small section for GoK, generation of knowledge, if we are evaluating track 1 and track 2, because expectation is that the evaluator or the evaluation is going to contribute to the GoK across all the tracks, track 1, 2, and 3. Since real estate is an issue, what we tend to do is we include a little table. We include the indicator, the data sources and methods, who is a responsible party, which would be the evaluator, the timing in terms of is it annual, semi-annual, per semester, depending on what we are trying to measure, a very brief analysis plan, and the general interpretation in terms of what procedures are we going to use, and the procedures for using the findings to answer the evaluation questions. So this really helps to provide the gist of the evaluation data matrix. Instead of writing pages and pages and paragraphs, everything could be condensed in this little table. And it has really worked well for us. So I would suggest that you could use it as well. A very simple table with indicators, data source, responsible party, timing, plan, and interpretation. And you can modify, add, or delete the columns depending on what your intentions might be. Okay, next slide, please. All right. So how do we engage and when do we engage a social science researcher and an evaluator specifically for track 3? The short answer is you have to engage them now. You have to engage them early and often. You have to look at the social science researcher, education researcher, and the evaluator as a partner and collaborator because they're really working with you on the project. So I mentioned that who could be the social science researcher and who could potentially be the evaluator, right? So the evaluator is generally external. The social science researcher could be a co-PI or a PI, and the evaluator could be from another department within your institution, if you so choose. You would also want to look for general qualifications of a social science researcher and likewise the evaluator. Do they have experience with S-STEM grants? Do they understand the aspects of low-income S-STEM scholars? Do they understand the needs? Do they understand the difference between research and evaluation? Most important. Then also they should be able to coordinate with each other in terms of writing the research and evaluation plan, avoiding the conflation between the two. As PI, co-PI, and grant writer, you should also be setting some general expectations from the third-party evaluator and social science researcher. When are they going to collect data? Is there going to be duplication? Is there going to be a separation? Are they going to share the data? Who is going to share with whom at what time? What are some of the dissemination processes? Is the evaluator publishing or is the researcher publishing? All these nuances must be figured out during this time. Keep in mind that if you're hiring an external evaluator, you should also be aware of the procurement procedures of the institution. Sometimes as evaluators, we are written to the grant only to be informed that the work was given to somebody else because the institution really doesn't follow the process of naming an evaluator and giving them the work, which is unfair, we think. So knowing these is really critical because it doesn't put the evaluator in a weird situation. Because evaluators, generally, they don't get paid in the pre-award process. We spend time writing the evaluation plan, coordinating with the team, and also coordinating with a social science researcher. But then we learn that the work was given to somebody else. Set aside a decent budget. You have a lot of money to play with in track 3. So set aside a good amount of money. Make sure that the work is really aligned with the qualifications and the scope of work. Usually we get the question, what is the percentage? Unfortunately, NSF doesn't state a percentage, but as experienced evaluators, we have generally requested for 10 to 15%, anywhere in the range of 10 to 15%. That has really worked well because the work really picks up. It really does in the years 4th, 5th, and 6th. So you could probably keep the budget a little lower in the first couple of years and then increase it so that a very rigorous and a really good evaluation is completed. So let's go to the next slide. Oh, there you go. So we are almost towards the end. So there are 3 questions that are related to research and evaluation. There's a definition of who an external evaluator is. They all actually come from the solicitation. So if you have a moment, you can just go through these FAQs that were posted actually last year. And the budget, again, there is no specificity of the budget, but as I mentioned, as an experienced evaluator, we generally request 10 to 15%. Next slide. So last year in January, M&A actually prepared a guidebook for preparing research and evaluation plans for NSF STEM grant proposals. So here's the QR code. We got very good reception and we hope that it is useful. So please check it out when you have a moment. Here are the references, and I think you will have access to all the slides so you can pull them up. Thank you. And now we are on to the questions.
So, are
Hello.
there any
Yeah.
questions? Maybe clarification from what is presented? All right, we have one from Gary Brook. When working with multiple institutions, how do you include leads? Forms from other institutions if you have maximum of 4 co-PIs?
What's the question again? Sorry, Nina.
So when working with multiple institutions, how do you include the leads from the other institutions if you have a maximum of 4 co-PIs?
Lead as to what? To do the work or because they generally tend to be mentors, faculty mentors, and they are generally the PIs at their institution. So they are really running the show at their institution.
So for track three, though, like say for example, you
Yeah,
have a 4-year university, and then you have a say community college, and then
sure.
you're trying to include them all, but you're limited to 4 co-PIs. What's a good solution?
Hmm.
Because then you also
So
have a researcher, and then
right, right. So they could be senior personnel. Some of them I've seen that they could be moved as senior personnel because they could be faculty mentors. And I don't think there is a limit on senior personnel. Right. In the track three that we are evaluating, we have the PI at the four-year institution. Then we have kind of a PI at the community college. Then we have two co-PIs at the community college, three and one at the four-year institution, and then we have a long list of senior personnel who are faculty mentors, they are admin people and others. Yeah, it will work well. I don't think NSF had a problem with that. Yeah. But this could also be asked as an NSF program officer, just to be sure as to how these could be. Yeah.
Right. Thanks. Next question. In regards to the interinstitutional consortia, can community organizations and/or nonprofits be considered an interinstitutional partners for a college university applying for this track?
I don't know the answer. I'm not going to lie. At least in
Mhm.
the work that we are doing, we have not seen a nonprofit organization. So I do not know. Sorry.
Yeah. So yes. So in this case, please ask
The
the
program officer.
program officers at
Mhm.
NSF.
Yeah. We really don't want to be misquoting you or saying something, and we don't want your proposal be rejected because we said something.
Yeah. Mhm. Any other
Any
questions?
research questions, any evaluation questions? I think we are very comfortable answering those because that's the purpose of M&A's role as the rec partner. If any of the slides was not clear, or if any of the questions were not clear, please come off mic and talk to us as colleagues and as friends. We are more than happy to talk through those. If not, we could probably share the survey and give about 15 minutes back to all these good people.
Well, I think I just saw a question come up. Just 1 second. Yep. Can you have a split research question, i.e., 2 parts?
Yeah, yeah. I gave several examples of those.
Mhm. All right. Right. We've got a question. I think it's like verbal. So,
Hey, Charles, come off
Charles.
camera.
Yep.
How are you?
Mhm.
Oh,
Yep.
hey, how are you doing? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. It's good to see you, Kavita. Great presentation. Super excited about the work that you're doing here. I do have a question. It came to mind is you mentioned the term structural condition and not demographic as a label for low income participants. Can
Mhm.
you can you explain what the difference is? I've always used demographic and not structural conditioning, so this is something very new to me.
Yeah. So the way we are looking at the low income status really is that that's like a constant, right? That is the whole premise of the S-STEM grant. So we're not using that as a weakness or as something that, we know that all of them are low income. That's why they are receiving the scholarship. That's why using that as a structural construct and not as a demographic limitation. That's why we are examining the mechanisms that lead to something that will help mitigate the effects of low income status.
So I'm seeing it as a constant, then
Mhm.
that is something that is honestly not going to change while they're in this
Eh,
program itself.
Correct.
Okay,
Correct. There you go.
okay,
Yes. Yes.
all right. Thank you. Yeah, I was curious though. It just kind of threw me off. I was used to hearing it as a demographic and not
I
as
understand. Yep.
a
Yep.
control as a control,
Yep.
honestly.
Any other questions?
Yep. Any other questions?
I see some familiar names here from last week. So, just a general question. Are you all applying for track one, two, and three, or you're just curious as to know the differences between track one, two, and three? Any responses? Nope.
Oh, here's one.
Yep.
Oh,
So Teresa asked something about building knowledge base in all areas. Okay, that's a comment. All right.
I see. Okay. Thanks,
Okay.
Teresa. Yeah.
Thanks, Teresa. Okay, Charles has another question. So go ahead.
yeah. Okay. Excuse me for that. I was reading through my notes I was taking, and I did notice I did have a question mark about EBPs. Now you showed one set of research questions without EBPs, and then the second one you discussed what those research questions look like with an EBP,
Mhm.
and you use the term unit of measurements. So we're not looking at it as just intervention at that point, or NSF is interested in grants that are implementing EBPs that are not just for intervention purposes, but also are means of measuring the research question.
There you
Am I
go.
correct?
Right. The mechanisms, right? The why and how. It's not only the what. That would be a very broad question in terms of, well, what's working, what's not working. That becomes an evaluative question, right? But the mechanisms underlying that are causing, that are influencing. So you're really looking at the causal mechanisms here.
And not just the influential ones, because but those are two different things, causal
Yes.
and the influential.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So are you telling me when you use an EBP, it's more of a causal research project we're looking at now, or
So EBPs generally are the ones, the activities or interventions, but we are looking at the why aspect of an EBP is influencing the impact or influencing the ultimate outcome, which is the retention, persistence, or post graduation success. So, for instance, if you're using self efficacy and you are running some mentoring programs, you're running, say, professional development programs that intend to increase the self efficacy, you want to make sure or you want to see what about that training program is or hopefully is going to influence positive scholar outcomes. So this could be a classic example because sense of belonging and sense of community building are often used in the STEM proposals. But what are the surrounding mechanisms which will allow these interventions to actually show an effect? And these effect, AFFET, could be dispositional, affective, conditional, or it could be behavioral. So that's the difference between the research and evaluation, fundamentally.
Okay, I see that difference. I'm curious about the means of measuring then. And is this from your example, I hear it as a survey, a pre-post of some sort,
Yes.
or
Yeah, there
even
are scales
longitudinal.
for sense of belonging. Charles, actually, we have a whole set of scales that are validated scales. If you go to that QR code and actually plug that in, you can download a bunch of scales that are, in a sense, aligned with the STEM scholars, not only K through 12. We actually did not do any K through 12. We just went into community college sense of belonging scales, four-year institutions belonging scales. And we also had a presentation of sense of belonging, actually, Nina, right, last year, in terms of how to validate and how to apply that specifically for a situation of STEM with low-income STEM scholars.
Thank you. And you just kind of mentioned something else, though.
Yeah.
Have you seen projects that are sponsored by this particular track that are, you said K-12, where K-12 are working with as a pathway from K-12 into a community college or into a university, a four-year university?
Mhm.
Ha-
Not K through 12, but only high school, because high schools could be pathways to going into community colleges or four-year institution, but not K through, middle school and such, but
Right.
essentially high
Okay.
schools. Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
that is a part of the interinstitutional is a high, for example, a high school into a university of some sort.
There you go. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we're at the 4:20 mark. Are there any
Sure.
other questions? Both, if
Can
you
I
want to
just make
post it.
one clarification, Kavita? I think I
Mhm.
just don't want to mislead somebody. I believe that the institutional has to involve all institutions of higher education. So it's not that a high school could be
Right. It
a
could not be a
PI or a
partner. Yes.
co-PI.
Yeah.
Yes,
They could
I
not
just
be
want
a
to make that
partner or a
clear.
co-PI. Yeah. Charles, if you're still here, yeah, they could not be a partner or a co-PI. Um, it's like they could use the high school as a recruitment mechanism. Yeah. But they're not part of the team, core team.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's
Thanks,
not,
Tara. Yeah.
the high school can be part of the interinstitutional
Yes.
consortium.
Yeah. Thank you, Tara. Yeah.
Thank you for the clarity. That's important.
Could probably launch the survey before we lose everybody.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. So we can,
You could still ask questions, come off
yes.
mute, come off the camera, happy to be here for a couple more minutes.
All right. So Rachel's posted a survey link in the chat, so feel free to use that. It's also available if you've already downloaded the slides. There is a QR code there too, along with the link. Okay, so thank you all for participating today. We'd love for all of you to stay connected with the REC through its website, newsletters, and social media. Please don't forget to register for the upcoming webinar on February 17th, which is going to be on generation of knowledge and evaluation plans. So we'll dig even further
No,
in
it's
that
on logic
arena.
model, Lena. It's on
Oh,
logic model and theory
sorry.
of change.
I'm sorry. I just realized. Yes. Sorry. It is about yes, it's about theory of change and logic
Yeah.
models. Thank you for that correction. So if anybody else has any questions, we'll still stay here until the 4:30 mark. But yes, so yes, please join us for that February 17th Theory of Knowledge and Logic Model, the webinar.
Also good to see Laura and Aditya.
Just want to say thank you all again. Thank you, Kavita.
Very welcome.
Definitely appreciate it. Good seeing you.
Yep.
Likewise. Bye.
I don't see any more questions. Should I
Okay.
give folks time
Yes.
back?
Yep,
Yes.
absolutely.
So thank you all, everyone.
Thank
Hope to
you.
see you next week.
Thanks,
Bye.
Nina and Kavita.
Sure. Thank you. Bye.